I was asked to talk about the world economy and the world economic crisis, and I guess I would say that in a different time, I might be talking about large parts of the world. Actually, preparing for this, I thought of an essay by the author George Orwell, who wrote one of his less-known essays, but he wrote a little essay about boys' novels in the 1930s. And he wrote at the time that it was odd that in the novels that were sold basically to boys, to teenage boys at the time, they always involved adventure taking place in Africa or in the jungles of South America or something. And he said, you know, the real place if you want to find adventure or danger, this was in the 1930s, the real place to find adventure or danger is in Europe. And so it is again right now. So the actual, the world, here is the exciting place, whereas, as always, in economics, exciting means bad. And this is where the crisis is. I'll talk a little bit at the beginning about the broader story, but mostly I think we need to talk about the situation in Europe. Just background. We are having an ongoing economic crisis. It's not just we had a high-speed financial crisis, roughly for 6 months after the failure of Lehman. We had an extreme disruption of financial markets, and that's long past now. And by most measures, financial stress in the United States, in the non-crisis countries of Europe, is back to roughly normal levels. But unfortunately, that hasn't meant a recovery. It's meant that we are, at best, in the United States, having a slow, creeping recovery, and of course, worse than that in the European community. It is important, I think, to stress that this is it is a broad crisis. I think of it as a North Atlantic crisis. Japan is in dire straits, but it has been for a long time. The places where this is new are in the United States and in Europe. And a word about the kind of crisis we're having. Different crises are not all the same, and this one is very much a type of crisis that we hadn't seen since the 1930s. It's a crisis of inadequate demand. And it is, I wouldn't actually say this is the world's worst crisis ever. The 1930s were the worst, but we're doing pretty well at having a really terrible time. So one of the motivating pictures I like to look at is simply, now this is slightly exceptional, but just look at Great Britain and compare it quarter by quarter with what happened in the 1930s. And what you see is that actually they're doing worse. The British are doing worse than they did in the 1930s. Now, partly that's because their Great Depression wasn't as bad as some others, but still, if your notion is that what we're going through is nothing like the last great crisis of the Western economies, you're wrong. This is actually something that is comparable, and certainly in duration, and at least for many countries, comparable in depth. This is the big one. This is the really huge crisis that we fear. This is, if you like, this is the nightmares of economists who studied history. Your dreams are occasionally troubled by the thought that something like the 1930s could happen again, and now it has. The broad form of the crisis is actually not a mystery. What happened was that the private sector, it was the private sector almost everywhere, the private sector overreached. We had a long period of complacency, a period in which old rules about acceptable levels of leverage, acceptable levels of debt were set aside. Then we had large real estate bubbles, both sides of the Atlantic, during the past decade, which encouraged even more leverage. Then the bubbles burst, and private sector spending collapsed. You had households unable to spend because of debt. corporations unwilling to invest because consumer demand had collapsed. So this is one of my few U.S. pictures. I'm going to show you a picture of the situation in the United States. A little easier to do it for the U.S. data, but it's the same picture. So the blue line there is the financial surplus of the U.S. private sector. It's the difference between saving and investment by the private sector as a whole, households and corporations combined. And it was a moderate deficit before the crisis hit. That moderate deficit was essentially covered by borrowing from China. And it has turned into a huge surplus. Households are saving more. Corporations are actually saving a lot through retained earnings. And investment has collapsed, both residential construction and, to a lesser extent, business investment. So the private sector has moved into a huge surplus. Now, the basics, if you like, the basic insight of macroeconomics is that we can't all be doing this. My spending is your income, and your income is my spending. And if everybody tries to spend less than his income, the result is that the economy contracts. So what has happened, in fact, is that the economies have contracted a lot and have only had a little bit of recovery. But to some extent, the decline has been limited by the fact that the public sector has moved into deficit. And so the private sector is spending much less than its income now. The public sector is spending much more than its income, not mostly because it's spending more, but because it's collecting less in the way of revenue. This is, at least for the short run, a good thing. You can argue that the fact that we have big governments that have moved into deficit is the main reason that we are not experiencing a full replay of the 1930s. Now, what I just showed you was an accounting identity, almost. It more or less has to be true that the government deficit matches the private sector surplus, not for any one country, but for a big country like the United States, close enough. How do we know which way the causation runs? How do we know that it isn't public deficits that are causing the private surplus? And the answer is we look at prices, and particularly we look at interest rates. And if you just take, and this is I believe this is my last US picture coming up. If we just look at the rate of interest at which the US government can borrow. So these are TIPS. These are Treasury inflation protected securities. So they are indexed to the consumer price index so that they're adjusted for inflation. Well, you know, a lot of people were warning that these big US government budget deficits would send interest rates sky high, which was just bad economics. It was a failure to understand the situation. And what's actually happened is that we have all of these savings that the private sector wants to make. The private sector wants to run a large financial surplus. It's got nowhere to go. It's the private sector doesn't see the investment opportunities. Governments in the rest of the world are not prepared to borrow lots of money. So what happens is the rate of return drops. And we are in this remarkable position now where inflation-adjusted, inflation-protected U.S. securities are negative interest rates. We're in a situation right now where the private sector sees so few opportunities to spend that it's prepared to actually, as long as the U.S. federal government will protect it against inflation, it's willing to actually pay the federal government to hold its savings safe. Which is true, by the way, it's true of all of the governments that are perceived as being safe, which really amounts to every advanced country that still has its own currency. So this is true for Germany, it's true for the UK, it's true for Sweden. We're all in a position of borrowing very, very cheaply right now. The problem with our economy, the problem with the US economy, is simply that there isn't enough spending. We're depressed because collectively the private sector is not willing to spend enough to make use of the capacity that's out there. It's not willing to spend enough to employ the 13 million people who are out of work and the 4 million people who've been out of work for more than a year. And in the United States, my policy recommendation, which is clear, simple, and getting absolutely nowhere in the political environment, is that we should be spending more, that we need fiscal stimulus, backed up by some more expansive policies from the Federal Reserve. So the U.S., the answers are easy for the United States. Also easy and also impossible, right? So that's been the tale in a lot of ways of the past several years, is that it's very clear, at least to me, what we should be doing. The trouble is that our political system isn't interested in doing the right thing. But that's our problem. And I guess I would say that these past several years, there's kind of a competition between the United States and the European Union. We're trying to see who can do a worse job of responding to this crisis. And at the moment, you guys are winning. You're ahead in that race to the bottom. Give us time, though. So, ask me again after the November election in the United States. But for the moment, Europe is winning that race to make the worst job of it. Okay. The European situation is much more difficult inherently than the U.S. situation. So the U.S. situation, if we only had political consensus and intellectual clarity, it would be straightforward to see how to resolve it. The U.S., we could simply provide a bunch of aid to reverse the austerity that's been taking place at the state and local level. We could convince my former department chairman at Princeton, now demoted to running the world, Ben Bernanke, we could convince him to do the things he advised the Japanese to do back in the year 2000, and the U.S. problem would be over. So politics is the problem, but we have Europe is much more difficult because Europe did something that was a noble enterprise and something that got a lot of people excited, seemed to be the right thing to do, seemed to be the vision for the future, but was actually, in retrospect and to some extent, even in prospect, a really bad idea, which was to introduce the single currency. So Europe went over to a single currency. With a lot of warnings, by the way, that this was going to be really problematic. You can go back. I was fairly involved in the debates over the desirability of the euro back around 1990, 1991. And quite a few objections were raised that the preconditions were not there. Some of those arguments are really clear now. So actually, before I even get into the whole thing of what should be done now and what will be done, which may not be at all the same thing, just to give you an example of the problems. So let me tell you about two economies that look in many ways very, very similar, which is the economy of Ireland and the economy of the state of Nevada. So they're identical. I mean, not the view out your window, obviously, but they both had similar size housing bubbles. They both have similar unemployment rates right now. Both had an extreme bubble, collapsed bubble, severe recession. But Ireland is in a fiscal crisis, and Nevada is not. And the reason is in Nevada, a lot of retired people in Nevada, those retired people get their pensions from the U.S. federal government in Washington. They get their health care from the U.S. federal government in Washington. To the extent that Nevada benefits from the U.S. military as a defense establishment, that's paid for from Washington. So Nevada, I actually been trying to do some numbers on this. As best I can make out, Nevada is receiving aid from the federal government. We don't call it that because it's all automatic. But if you include the payments of Social Security, Medicare that are not paid for by taxes, if you include the unemployment benefits, which come from Washington, the food stamps, Nevada is effectively receiving transfers, not loans, but transfers from the U.S. federal government on the order of around 6% or 7% of GDP. In other words, Nevada is receiving aid on a scale that no European crisis country can, in its wildest imagination, dream of receiving. That's because we have a truly federal system, which is why the US can work fairly easily with a single currency. Europe cannot. So Europe has a much more difficult thing. Trying to make this single currency work was always going to be difficult. And we should have seen it coming. The problem in Europe, from my perspective, is the one that everyone worried about, if you were sensible, 20 years ago, which is the problem of asymmetric shocks, the problem of something happening that differentially affects different parts of the currency zone, and the lack of any good way to adjust to those shocks. At the time, I think the view was pretty much that sound policies would ensure that there would be no major asymmetric shocks, which was always a foolish notion, if you ask me. But in any case, what happened was the mother of all asymmetric shocks. And so we've had this terrible, terrible dilemma within the European system. Now, for the European, a lot of the argument, so for the last 2.5 years, really ever since Greece hit the skids fiscally, the European official view has been that this is all about fiscal responsibility. It's all about governments that were profligate, and now they have to make up for that with austerity. Here's the list of countries for which that story has some truth, the full list of countries for which that story has some truth. Greece, end of list. Greece is completely unique. The Greek story is infuriating because the Greeks have actually poisoned the well for everybody else. The rest of the countries did not do fiscal irresponsibility, at least not what was seen as being fiscally irresponsible at the time. And the quintessential crisis country now, the core of the problem, is actually Spain. And just as a reminder, because people do forget this, here's a comparison of Spain and Germany before and after the crisis. This is, see if we can get to the next one. Oops, sorry, go back. Well, in between, right where we skipped. Okay, this is the public debt to GDP ratio in Germany and in Spain during the run-up to the crisis, and by the way, even now. Now this will start to move fairly quickly, I guess, because Spain is about to have the Irish experience of finding that the liabilities of the banks are in fact liabilities of the public sector. But up until now, even now, Spain has a lower debt to GDP ratio than Germany. And of course, during the run-up to the crisis, Spain was running budget surpluses, had a growing economy, so its debt levels were falling. Spain appeared to be an icon of fiscal responsibility. We know what happened. I'll talk about that more, but it wasn't fiscal irresponsibility. And yet the recipe for solving the Eurozone's problems up until just about now has been entirely based upon the view that fiscal austerity is the answer. We need to reverse those irresponsibility, and that's the route forward. You might ask, and many of us did ask, what will happen if if everybody's tightening, fiscal contraction, isn't that going to really do a lot of damage to the economies? We already have depressed economies, high unemployment. Won't that make it even worse? And 2 years ago, I still think it's a remarkable story to look at the way the discussion went 2 years ago as Europe made this turn, the United States to a lesser extent, but as Europe made this turn towards austerity policies as the centerpiece of everything. There was widespread acceptance of a highly speculative economic doctrine, which was the notion that austerity at the government level would actually be expansionary for the private economy. So the doctrine of expansionary austerity, which is not standard economics. It's not what the textbooks say. It was backed by basically 2 papers that were widely cited, but actually did not stand up at all well under examination. It was just a generally very dubious thing, which somehow got adopted, I guess because it was politically and emotionally appealing, and it got adopted. And I usually quote Jean-Claude Trichet saying foolish things about this, not because he's actually any worse than a lot of other people, but because of his position, and because actually there's a certain clarity in how he speaks that makes him quotable when he says something that's obviously wrong. So I feel bad, because I have no personal problems with Trichet, but he is quotable on these things. And above all, the claim was that, that despite the evident direct negative impact of government cuts on the economy, that it would nonetheless be positive because it would inspire confidence. And so my contribution, I think, to the language of economics has been, I invented a phrase for that belief, which is the, I called it believing in the confidence fairy. And I have a picture here in a second, I think. A friend actually sent me this. So it's a little statue. That's the confidence fairy. This is on my bookshelf at home. That's the confidence fairy who will make everything better when you contract government spending, and who unfortunately has failed to make an appearance in real life. For those who are wondering, by the way, the mug that's sitting behind, that's a beer mug that I found at a flea market sale. That's a beer mug with the face of Herbert Hoover. So if you're want your American, there's a little bit of American history in there as well. All right. This hasn't worked. If you were thinking that that austerity was going to actually inspire confidence and lead to a European expansion, it hasn't worked out that way at all. And at this point, I guess for future textbooks, we'll be in a position to, when somebody says, how do we know that this stuff you say about Keynesian economics, that says that fiscal expansion boosts the economy and fiscal contraction shrinks the economy, how will we know? And it actually, historically, it's been very hard to provide really clear evidence, because big changes in fiscal policy don't happen that often. For the United States, most of our evidence comes from wars. Actually, most places, mostly comes from wars. Military buildups and military drawdowns are the major examples. Those, fortunately, don't happen very often. And also, they're often accompanied by other things happening. But now, if you want experiments, you want somebody to perform a major experiment in economics to see what actually works in terms of policy, well, the Eurozone has done it. And so we can produce charts like this. This is showing, oops, is that, did we miss one there? We missed one, there we are. This is showing first election, but it doesn't change much. The austerity is measured by the change in an estimate of the structural balance of general government. So for those, probably people know that you want to correct, when a country goes into a recession, the budget typically moves into deficit, but that's not a change in policy, that's just a fall in revenue. So we try to correct for that, and this is the IMF's measure. We can see and then we can see the actual results in terms of economic growth, and just look at it. The countries that have practiced extreme austerity, which so far have been Ireland and Greece, with Portugal coming along in that dimension, have all suffered extreme economic contractions. So in case you are wondering, yep, there it is. So these austerity policies have greatly deepened the slump in the countries that practice them. Now, that's not saying, you could say, well, if you were the Prime Minister of Ireland, what would you do differently? And that's an interesting question. I'll get to that. But the answer is it's not mostly something that can be solved at the individual country level. But the point is that these austerity policies have not produced economic recovery. On the contrary, they've deepened the slump. We're saying that this is really very serious stuff. We're not, this is GDP, but thinking, as you all know, think about what this all means for employment. Think about what's happening in these countries. So in Greece and in Spain, which has not had a bigger contraction of GDP, but a terrible employment record, youth unemployment is above 50%. In Ireland, it's 30%. So even aside from the suffering of older workers who are out of work and see no prospect, what is this doing to the next generation? So it's a social and an economic catastrophe, and bids fair to become a political catastrophe. But I'll get there in a few minutes also. So what about success stories? Doesn't austerity finally bring rewards? And people keep on looking for rewards. They keep on looking for something to turn up. And it is important in the European context to say that there are no success stories. There are things that have been called success stories, but they're a very funny definition of success. So this is two countries that have been described as success stories for austerity. Ireland, the poor Irish. They sometimes, some of their economists write about this, the dangers, the suffering that comes with being viewed as an example. The Irish keep on being held up as an example of success. They've had austerity, but now they're on the road to growth. And this has happened twice, summer of 2010 and then again last fall, that the Irish were told, we're held up as a role model of success, except it keeps on sort of not coming. And then we hear Latvia has been held up as a success story because they are growing. But geez, after an incredible economic decline. So Latvia is, by that same token, the United States in 1935 was a success story because we grew pretty rapidly from 1933 to 1935, except we were still deep in the Great Depression, and more or less the same thing right now. What about the bond markets? So a lot of this is about trying to supposedly satisfy the bond markets. And it is just worth pointing out, actually Latvia, which didn't have much debt to begin with, has regained access to the markets. But Ireland, despite, the Irish have been the good soldiers. They've done everything they were asked to do. It still hasn't gotten them back in the good graces of the market. So if we take a look at, whoops, if we can have that slide back. If we can take a look at the CDS spread. I'd use the bond rates also, but this one was just a little easier to produce the picture. Wow, all of this austerity, 15% unemployment, 30% youth unemployment, savage cuts in public services, GDP, actually GNP, for technical reasons, is a better measure for Ireland, but GNP down by, both of them down by double digits. And still, nowhere close to being able to actually return to financial markets. So this has been a real ongoing disaster. Okay, so what actually are the prospects? I think, well, the crucial thing for Europe now, I think, is to understand what the real problem is. And the real problem is not actually the fiscal deficits. It's not even the collapse of bond market confidence, though those are symptoms. Those are symptoms of the broader underlying problem. The fundamental problem within the Eurozone is that that the coming of the euro caused a period of misplaced optimism, and that it's now extremely difficult to undo the effects of that era of misplaced optimism. More or less, I mean, this is actually a pretty close, it sounds like it's oversimplifying, but I think it really isn't. With the coming of the euro, investors believed that all Eurozone debt was safe. What could go wrong? And so there was a lot of, there was very nearly an equalization of borrowing costs all across the euro area. Even so, and that was a big change. Historically, Spanish rates had been significantly higher than German rates. Greek rates quite a lot higher than German rates. And so there was this, that collapsed. Money became cheap. Naturally, fueling large capital inflows into Southern Europe, fueling a large a surge of money, also, of course, housing bubbles, a great boom in Southern Europe. That was, it was a consequence of people feeling that the risks of economic instability in Europe had been ended. Well, okay. And the flip side of that is that there were large movements of trade balances within Europe. And this is your sort of basic story of the European picture. So these are the current account balances of, measured as a share, by the way, of the combined GDP of the euro area, just as a kind of a way to normalize it, of Germany on the one side, and so that's Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Italy. I know people like other versions of that acronym. I think that, actually it turns out there's no good way to do this. If you use pigs, then people say you're being racist, but it turns out that using this one, I also get accused of being racist. I don't know what to do here, but anyway, the crisis countries, which are, by the way, just to think about the scale of this, now that Italy is in that club, this is now a third of European GDP. So we're no longer talking about some small peripheral problem. We're talking about a good, solid third of the European economy is in crisis. This is all money, this is a vast flow of money from north to south, roughly speaking. Ireland, a little bit funny case, but basically, flow of money from north to south. Who's responsible for that? Well, with the exception of the government of Greece, it's not governments at all. It's private sector. Private sector transactions, there were two sides to those transactions. So there's this tendency now to say, oh, look at those Spaniards who borrowed irresponsibly. But if a Spanish caja makes what turns out to have been a bad housing loan, which was financed by borrowing on the wholesale market from a German Landesbank, who exactly is the guilty party here? And I think the answer is nobody. Everybody was over-optimistic. It was just a general belief that nothing really bad could happen. There are things that have been called success stories, but they're a very funny definition of success. So this is two countries that have been described as success stories for austerity. Ireland, the poor Irish. They sometimes, some of their economists write about this, the dangers, the suffering that comes with being viewed as an example. The Irish keep on being held up as an example of success. They've had austerity, but now they're on the road to growth. And this has happened twice, summer of 2010 and then again last fall, that the Irish were told, we're held up as a role model of success, except it keeps on sort of not coming. And then we hear Latvia has been held up as a success story because they are growing. But geez, after an incredible economic decline. So Latvia is, by that same token, the United States in 1935 was a success story because we grew pretty rapidly from 1933 to 1935, except we were still deep in the Great Depression, and more or less the same thing right now. What about the bond markets? So a lot of this is about trying to supposedly satisfy the bond markets. And it is just worth pointing out, actually Latvia, which didn't have much debt to begin with, has regained access to the markets. But Ireland, despite, the Irish have been the good soldiers. They've done everything they were asked to do. It still hasn't gotten them back in the good graces of the market. So if we take a look at, if we can have that slide back. If we can take a look at the CDS spread, I'd use the bond rates also, but this one was just a little easier to produce the picture. Wow, all of this austerity, 15% unemployment, 30% youth unemployment, savage cuts in public services, GDP, actually GNP, for technical reasons, a better measure for Ireland, but GNP down by, both of them down by double digits. And still, nowhere close to being able to actually return to financial markets. So this has been a real ongoing disaster. Okay, so what actually are the prospects? I think, well, the crucial thing for Europe now, I think, is to understand what the real problem is. And the real problem is not actually the fiscal deficits. It's not even the collapse of bond market confidence, though those are symptoms. Those are symptoms of the broader underlying problem. The fundamental problem within the Eurozone is that that the coming of the euro caused a period of misplaced optimism, and that it's now extremely difficult to undo the effects of that era of misplaced optimism. More or less, I mean, this is actually a pretty close, it sounds like it's oversimplifying, but I think it really isn't. With the coming of the euro, investors believed that all Eurozone debt was safe. What could go wrong? And so there was a lot of, there was very nearly an equalization of borrowing costs all across the euro area. Even so, and that was a big change. Historically, Spanish rates had been significantly higher than German rates, Greek rates quite a lot higher than German rates. And so there was this, that collapsed. Money became cheap. Naturally, fueling large capital inflows into Southern Europe, fueling a large surge of money, also, of course, housing bubbles, a great boom in Southern Europe. That was, it was a consequence of people feeling that the risks of economic instability in Europe had been ended. Well, okay. And the flip side of that is that there were large movements of trade balances within Europe. And this is your sort of basic story of the European picture. So these are the current account balances of, measured as a share, by the way, of the combined GDP of the euro area, just as a kind of a way to normalize it, of Germany on the one side, and so that's Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Italy. I know people like other versions of that acronym. I think that, actually it turns out there's no good way to do this. If you use pigs, then people say you're being racist, but it turns out that using this one, I also get accused of being racist. I don't know what to do here, but anyway, the crisis countries, which are, by the way, just to think about the scale of this, now that Italy is in that club, this is now a third of European GDP. So we're no longer talking about some small peripheral problem. We're talking about a good, solid third of the European economy is in crisis. This is all money, this is a vast flow of money from north to south, roughly speaking. Ireland, a little bit funny case, but basically, flow of money from north to south. Who's responsible for that? Well, with the exception of the government of Greece, it's not governments at all. It's private sector. Private sector transactions, there were two sides to those transactions. So there's this tendency now to say, oh, look at those Spaniards who borrowed irresponsibly. But if a Spanish caja makes what turns out to have been a bad housing loan, which was financed by borrowing on the wholesale market from a German Landesbank, who exactly is the guilty party here? And I think the answer is nobody. Everybody was over-optimistic. It was just a general belief that nothing really bad could happen, which of course was wrong. The counterpart of these capital flows was they have to be, the capital flows translated to trade imbalances. What's the mechanism through which that happens? It's basically differential inflation. All that money flowing into Southern Europe meant that there was higher inflation, higher growth in costs. And so if we look at unit labor costs, which are various, again, there are many different measures, but just look at what happened to unit labor costs in manufacturing, starting from the creation of the euro. You have Germany flat, Spain, great increase. And so, of course, Spanish manufacturing becomes uncompetitive. Spain runs a large trade deficit, which does not appear to be a problem in 2005, because there's all this housing construction which is keeping the economy booming. But of course, turns out to have been a problem in retrospect. A couple of things to say about that before I move on. One is, we get a lot of lecturing right now from Germany, saying, well, we did austerity and it worked and we were able to recover. And the German economy was actually fairly weak in the late 1990s, and it came out. The question is, well, how did that happen? And the answer is, well, you had a nice export market in Southern Europe that was inflating away and making plenty of room. So if you want Spain to redo what you did, where is the counterpart taking place in the European core to what happened in the European periphery when the core was making its way up? The other thing is a lot of saying, oh, well, people should have known that this was all wrong. It was not easy. Let's put it this way: even if you did say that there was something very dangerous, it was very hard to persuade anybody. When things are going well, nobody wants to hear it. So I was at a meeting, I wish I could pin it down, it was either 2005 or 2006, a meeting in Barcelona where we were talking about economic developments, and Olivier Blanchard, who's now the chief economist at the International Monetary Fund and a longtime colleague of mine at MIT, gave a paper basically saying, I'm scared as hell about the Spanish situation because of this huge external deficit. This looks like a bubble to me. And he was just brushed aside. You know, what do you know? You just don't understand how well we're doing things. So it always is. Okay. What do you do? Now that this has happened, how are we going to have a recovery? And the answer is, well, essentially you need to reverse what happened during those years. You need to have those Southern European economies go back to being competitive in trade so they don't need all those capital inflows and housing bubbles. Everything else follows from that. The budget problems are fundamentally it's fundamentally a balance of payments problem, which gets translated into a budget problem. Now, how are you going to return those trade flows around? Well, that's really, really hard, right? So if we still had European currencies, we'd say devalue the peseta, devalue the drachma. That would be the route. So instead, since we don't have those, the official strategy has been internal devaluation. Basically, we're going to squeeze down costs and prices in the periphery, and they will gradually restore competitiveness. This is really hard. Nobody is that flexible. And just my last picture for this talk. This is actual changes in labor costs, wages actually, wage compensation from 2009 to 2011. And what you see is that Ireland, which is the good boy, has achieved some modest fall in wages, but it's modest. And that's years and years of grinding austerity and high unemployment. Still a slow process. The others, basically not at all. And Germany, by the way, is not cooperating by having the rapid wage growth that would be the flip side that would make it easy. And so to add to this, one more thing, which is that we do have high levels of both public and private debt. And if you have a deflating economy, the real burden of that debt gets worse. And so that is your European crisis. And it's unworkable, right? The current strategy is just not workable. It's asking too much. You cannot expect Spain, Greece to go through years and years of 30% youth unemployment, 25%, 30% unemployment, 60% youth unemployment, trying to squeeze down those wages to the point where they become competitive. It's just not going to happen. So what does happen? And that's where we are right now. There are two ways. This is not going to continue. There are two ways it could not continue. One is breakup of the euro. Perhaps one country at a time, but countries leave. They reintroduce a new currency. This is nightmarish. It's a horrible scenario because you have all these debts that are in euros. What do they become? There's enormous disruption. I think it's basically no prime minister can go and say, okay, I've decided we're going to leave the euro, because he will be held responsible for the chaos that results. Which doesn't mean it can't happen, because what can happen is that simply things fall apart and you're off. And among other things, the prime minister is booted out and a new government comes in. We've seen this movie. It's Argentina in 2001. It was easier for them because they still did have their own currency, although it was supposedly immutably pegged to the dollar. I knew the people involved. They kind of saw it coming, but there was just no way that the De La Rua government could actually decide to end the convertibility law. What you had to do was have the banking crisis, fall of the government, reopen the banks, new government, and new currency regime. And in this case, new currency. That's right. That we're not now talking about some remote prospect. I think it's got to be significantly, I'd say 2-to-1, 3-to-1 odds that that's what's going to happen to Greece. Just don't see how it works out otherwise. Now, what happens afterwards? Argentina, after one terrible year, had a roaring recovery. Greece, it's going to be tougher, among other things, because their likely export sector is tourism, and how many people are going to want to take package tours to a country that's in the grip of political chaos? So this is going to be, but that's one route, and maybe this ripples all the way through. The other route out is change in European policy. I think too late. Greece is probably beyond. The Greek euro is not sustainable. But the Spanish. What about the Spanish situation? Well, you need to give the Spaniards a reasonable hope of being able to run the disequilibrium in reverse. They need to have a situation where they can get back to being competitive without having to undergo massive deflation. Can that be done? Only if the Germans are willing to accept substantial inflation themselves, and in fact, probably only if the overall Eurozone inflation rate is significantly higher than the rates that are now being considered acceptable. So give me 3.5% Eurozone inflation, 4.5% German inflation, and maybe this thing is workable. Okay, so what everybody says is that's impossible. They'll never accept that, although the Germans made an interesting statement yesterday that suggested that at least a small step toward realism. But when you say, but how about a breakup of the euro? Well, that's also impossible. So, but one of these things is going to happen. So one of these two impossible things is going to happen. And I guess 50-50 odds, right? Since we have no way of really assessing. This is a political question, but they're very serious. And this is extraordinary. It's extreme. Last thing, because I know I've run over on time. What about the political implications? Failure of the euro would be a terrible, terrible thing. The European project. I think the euro was a mistake. If I could go back in a time machine, I'd run into the hall at Maastricht and say, "Don't do it." Right? Big mistake. But failure of it now is a catastrophic blow to the whole notion of a unified, peaceful, democratic Europe. You don't want to let that happen. The things that are happening now are ugly. I'm happy to see Hollande win in France, because I think that brings some flexibility. The Greek election, problem is all of the reasonable people were part of a national unity government presiding over a failing party. And who's left? Who are the winners? Is the extreme fringes. So we now have ghosts of the 1930s suddenly coming back to life, not just in Greece but elsewhere in Europe. And nobody, this is very frightening stuff. Hell of a story. And I guess I'm praying that Frankfurt and Berlin find a way to drop their notions of what is right and proper and realize that this is not a morality play, and that they have to accept some things that they don't really like if they want to save the European project, which they damn well better do, or we'll all pay the price. Thank you. Okay.